Welcome back. In this video, we're going to explore our continuing journey through the story of Abraham in Genesis 13 to 14. And we're going to be looking at Abram and Lot, a story of separation and rescue. In Genesis 13, we encounter Abraham after his fall in Egypt. And we read, so Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. So in Genesis 13, 1 to 2, Abram goes back up to the promised land from Egypt with his wife and everything that he had, including his possessions that he had gained at Sarai's expense. Notice, Sarai's name is not called at all. She's simply referred to as his wife. And I think this denotes the fact that in doing what he did, Abram really had objectified Sarai. And we're told as well that Lot went with him. And so we're learning for the first time that Lot was there with Abraham whilst he was in Egypt. We're told that Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and that he had, in essence, become very wealthy as a result of compromising with his wife. Now, Abraham in verses 3 to 4 retraces his steps, and it calls on the name of Yahweh again. The repetition of the words to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, and to the place where he had made an altar at the first, indicates that the narrator is making a point that Abram is trying to return to where he was in his relationship with God prior to Egypt and to recapture his experience with God. He is seeking again the divine presence from which the order that God wants established for all humanity can flow. And we read that there, at the altar that Abram had previously made, Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And this recalls Genesis 12:8, where Abram built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And that in turn recalls Genesis 4:26, in which people began to call on the name of the Lord after Seth's son Enosh was born. So Abram is turning back to God after having turned away in Egypt and being a son of the snake. He's returning to the path of the godly line of the seed of the woman. We have, in essence, Abraham repenting. He is turning away from being a seed of the snake and line and turning back to being a seed of the woman and calling on the name of the Lord so that God can work through his life to bring blessing to others. Although the text is not explicit, it does seem that Abram's return to where he first encountered God in the land and worshipped him indicates that he's repenting and recommitting himself to Yahweh. And so we read, and Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Now, Abram's return and renewal with God is followed by a test, similar to how his entry into the land in Genesis 12 was followed by a test of famine that led to his going into Egypt and his failure there because of his fear. In this instance, there is no famine, but the land that God had brought Abraham to could not support both Abraham and Lot's flocks of herds and their tents. Part of the problem is the possessions that Abram and Lot have acquired in Egypt. All this stuff that he got from protecting himself out of fear instead of trusting God and protecting Sarah was complicating his life. But also, God had told him to separate from his family and to go to the land he was sending him to. And Abram had taken Lot with him, what God intended for him to separate from Lot and his family. So Abram's choices were presenting problems for him in Canaan. Additionally, he could not take possession of the land as yet because the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Abram responds to this test differently than he did to the test in Genesis 12. He is growing. He doesn't leave the land, and he doesn't act out of fear in an effort to protect and preserve himself and his possessions as he did in Egypt. Rather, he acts in faith by letting go and trusting God to take care of him by giving Lot the choice of where to go in the land. The verse reads, "Then Abram said to Lot, 'Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left.'" You see right here that Abraham is being very big. He's not clutching. He's not trying to protect himself. He decides to be the bigger man. And he says to Lot, "You choose and I will take what is left." And he's able to do this because he's able to trust that God is going to take care of him. And God is going to give the land to his descendants as he promised. Well, in Genesis 13, 10 to 11, we read that Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So Lot goes east. And so far in Genesis, east is away from God. When Adam and Eve sin and they're sent out the garden, there's cherubim standing at the gate, preventing their access back into the garden. And that tells us that we're told that the cherubim are posted in the east. That means that when they go out the garden, they go east. Similarly, when God expels Cain and he has to wander, he goes to the east. And the people in Babel, they go east to build this tower. So Lot, in going east, is going after what looks good in his own eyes. And he's looking for an earthly Garden of Eden in the Jordan Valley, like Abraham looked for one in Egypt. But this is a false Eden. It's populated by wicked men who are great sinners against Yahweh. And in verses 12 to 13, unlike Lot, Abram chooses to stay in the promised land, whereas Lot settles near Sodom with wicked people. And so we have here again this repeated pattern where Lot sees what is good in his own eyes, and he takes what he thought would be best, and he ends up with disappointing results in that Sodom is inhabited by wicked men who sin greatly against the Lord, and it eventually is invaded, and Lot is taken captive, and he has to be rescued by Abraham, and eventually God judges Sodom for its wickedness, and Lot barely escapes in Genesis 19. In verses 14, we read, "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, 'Lift up your eyes,'" because Lot had lifted up his eyes and seen the Jordan Valley. God says to Abram, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. So after Lot is gone, God tells Abraham that he will give him the promised land to him and to his offspring forever, and that his offspring will be like the dust. And the point is that Abraham has made the right choice by trusting in God and not acting in fear and clutching and trying to protect himself. By leaving to God to provide for him, God has promised him that he will have all the land and it will be given to his descendants. And so Abraham, we're told, God tells him to arise and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. And Abram moves his tent and came and settles by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he builds an altar to the Lord. So he walks through the land as if it is his own, and he pitches his tent and he builds an altar to Yahweh, again denoting the presence of God in the land. In Genesis 14, we see clearly that Abram made the right choice to stay in the land where God was building a new Garden of Eden, and that Lot had made a bad choice by going after what looked good in his eyes. Because in Genesis 14, we learn that four kings, not kids, from Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia includes Shinar, that's a region in Genesis 11 from which they built the Tower of Babel, and it's also the region where Ur of the Chaldeans, where Abraham was asked to move from, is located. And these kings follow Abraham to Canaan, and they make war with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot has relocated. Now, it tells us that this false Eden where Lot has relocated attracts the Babylonians. It's the same search for a false Eden that they had pursued in building the Tower of Babel in the rich, fertile alluvial river plain in Shinar. The five kings rebel against overlordship of one of the Mesopotamian kings, and he and his three allies invade Canaan to punish them. They defeat the Canaanite kings, plunder their cities and territories, and take away captives, including Lot, who is living in Sodom. Abram learns about this from where he is in Canaan, and he, along with 318 trained men in his household and his Canaanite allies from Mamre and Hebron, chase the Mesopotamian kings as far as Dan, and they rescue Lot and bring him back with other captives and plunder to Canaan. And then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. So on Abram's return from rescuing Lot, he's met by two different Canaanite kings. The king of Sodom and Melchizedek, who's king of Salem, most likely king of Jerusalem. Melchizedek is a mysterious fifth Canaanite king who is not involved in the quarrel. There are 5 Mesopotamian kings and 4 Canaanite kings. When you add Melchizedek, you get the round number of 10. There's a contrast between the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. The king of Salem is the word in Hebrew for peace. So Melchizedek comes out with bread and wine, showing hospitality, and as priest of God Most High blesses Abraham, but the king of Sodom comes out saying, "Gimme, gimme." Melchizedek comes out and he says, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and king of Salem means king of peace. Salem is, of course, Jerusalem. And he's priest of God Most High, which Abraham equates with Yahweh. He's priest and king, And Psalm 110 in the book of Hebrews tells us, by virtue of him being a priest and a king, he's a type or a foreshadowing of Jesus. And he comes out to meet Abram with blessing and generous giving, and he blesses Abram by God Most High, which is how he refers to Yahweh. And he points out that it is by Yahweh that Abram's enemies have been delivered into his hands, like Yahweh delivered Noah from the flood. Now that word delivered is from the same root as the word shield, which is at the beginning of the next chapter, Genesis 15:1, where God tells Abram that he is his shield, his great reward. And so Abram responds with reciprocal generosity, which reflects his understanding that God provides everything. He's not grasping like he did in Egypt. Abram is able to let go and to give because he's living by faith and not by fear. By contrast, the king of Sodom demonstrates a grasping, fearful, worldly way of taking to protect self and provide for self. This is the gimme, gimme attitude. We read that the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I've lifted my hand to Yahweh, God Most High." You see, he equates God Most High with Yahweh, Lord. "Possessor of heaven and earth." God possesses everything. "That I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. That Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." So Abram takes nothing from Sodom because he's learned his lesson that God, who's a possessor of heaven and earth, provides for him. He equates Yahweh with Melchizedek's God Most High, who's a possessor of heaven and earth, meaning everything, and he won't allow the king of Sodom to say that he made him rich, like the king of Egypt could say because of him putting Sarah in the position that he did. He chooses to rely on God. And so we end Genesis 14 with Abraham in a good place. He's learned to not give in to fear, but to trust God. And God has blessed him and others through him as a result of his faith. He is on his way in the right direction. He is becoming the kind of man that God wants him to be.